گلاره من میتونم یه اطلاعات مختصری بهتون بدم. اینکه گلاره گذشته از اینکه از دوستای قدیمی منه و ما با هم دیگه در یک دانشگاه درس میخونیم sci-arc، فارغ التحصیل دانشگاه sci-arc در مقطع لیسانس. گلاره بلافاصله بعد از اینکه فارغ التحصیل شد از sci-arc در دفتر معماری VTBS یکی از آرکیتکچرال دیزاینرهاشون شد که یه کی ایمپلوی خیلی خیلی اصلی هستش توی اون شرکت و در واقع she's a selling point of the company. بیشتر پروژه هاشون رو برای presentation و دیزاین خیلی عالی، دقیق و آن پوینت انجام میده. گلاره یکی از خصوصیت های تخصصیش که خیلی بارز هستش، من میتونم بگم که دید بسیار متفاوتی داره نسبت به خیلی از طراحایی که توی فیلد کاری ما هستن، خیلی از معمارا. شاید یه مکعب خیلی ساده رو خیلی وقتا به گلاره اگر نشون بدین چیزای خیلی عجیب غریبی توش ببینه که کمتر کسی قادره یه همچین چیزایی رو تجسم کنه و ازش اکسترکت کنه و بیرون بکشه. این رو میتونم بگم که گلاره خیلی توی ذهنیتش قوی داره از چیزی که نیست و این تجسم رو که میتونه خلق بکنه، فیلدهای جدید رو، پترنهای جدید رو و اینا رو از حالت دو بعدی به حالت سه بعدی برسونه. در کنار فعالیتش و کار حرفه‌ایش در VTBS، گلاره نزدیک 2 ساله که در کوفاندر شرکت آرتبورد، شرکت آرتبورد هم یه در واقع دیزاین استودیوی کوچیکیه که کارهای فابریکیشن انجام میده که یه چیزی بین آرت و آرکیتکچره. اونجا هم در واقع پترناش بسیار خاص و پرطرفداره و یه چیزی حدود 2 سال هم هستش که در سیاپ فعالیت مداوم داره، در قسمت سوشال میدیا کمک میکنه، فعاله. یه چیزی بوده بله 1 سال 2 سال فعالیت های اینستاگرام پریتی ماچ دست گلاره است که فکر میکنم امسال این مقدارم بیشتر شده، بنابراین از کارهای خوبش بیشتر هم خواهید دید. من کوتاه میکنم حرف رو و اجازه میدم که خودتون ببینید خلاقیتش واقعا در چه سطحیه و مطمئنم که سیاپ واقعا استفاده خواهد کرد از حضور یه همچین تالنتی به عنوان یکی از اعضاش. مرسی.
Section 2014. During my time at sci-arc, I tried to work with a variety of architects, artists, designers. It's one of my things to be able to explore the different ideas and perspective views of different architects and designers, just to get a feel, like, sense of how they work. I kind of separated it into sections of how I'm going to present this. I'm going to give you a little background of the work, kind of work that I've done with other people, offices that I worked for, and then I'm going to talk about where I actually initially got this idea for my undergraduate thesis. I'm going to talk about precedents, case studies that I've studied for my thesis, and eventually I'm going to talk about the thesis itself. Thank you. So the title is flipped, and no, the projector is not oriented in the wrong way, but it's actually flipped. Throughout the time, I'm going to tell you why I'm actually naming flip. Flip is not specifically just a name, but it talks about the process. And this thesis is an urban planning project. It didn't start it that way, but eventually it started to be an urban planning project. I work for Seriabot. They are a technology programming company. One of the main things that they developed is these little nod systems throughout that is making it very easy for them to be able to create all these different forms from these trusses. Usually you see trusses in a vertical and horizontal way, but now they are presented in like curves, impossible curves, and they are also projected with different projections. So it's all about fabrication, different technology built. And if you go to Coachella, these two are from Coachella from the top, and if you ever attend the summer concerts in the Santa Monica Pier, the one on the corner is this permanent stage that they built for the Santa Monica Pier. I worked for Patrick Thai Architecture, which is a local in Santa Monica area. His work is mainly mixed-use, single housing, and he also does installations. One of the main things that he works with is sustainable architecture, creating the analysis and getting to know these new idea and new way of fabricating and materials. So in a couple of the projects, the screen system that they created for these buildings is the new innovative way of fabricating these things. And right now I'm working for VTBS, which is Van also a local office. Most of the work that they do is in Los Angeles, in mixed use, and big scale projects. So busy. Flipped is a little statement that I have. I'm going to read it for you. Cities have patterns. The patterns represent infrastructure, circulation, public spaces, topography, everything including buildings. Typically, architects insert architecture into cities as if they were buildings only. They might refer to or service the city through apertures and site conditions such as plinth or footprints, but usually this comes from a sensitivity to the site and not a formal and generative relation to the many possible city patterns. This thesis seeks not a reading or a reference, but an aggressive use of a pattern as a formal device for creating a city. A pattern in some ways, like an ubiquitous grid, is overlaid on an urban swath, but unlike the grid, this formal device generates dimensional urban conditions. The graphic of a pattern is intentionally both 2D and 3D. In this way, the horizontal plane of the pattern as the exact streets and blocks can be flipped, turned vertically to create streets between buildings and buildings nested into each other. Urban connectivity is achieved both through the complexity of the pattern and its unifying capabilities across the site. Through a new geometric topography of the pattern, unexpected spatial and sectional urban conditions emerge. This is an overall statement of what the thesis ended up being at the end. To break it in sections, usually cities, they have these patterns and grid system, but usually when you put a building into a site, you don't necessarily think about the site. Maybe you manipulate your architectural building a little bit to kind of complement it, but you don't really think about the site as much. So this is kind of an overall. The site, in my 4th year studio, I started this program, which my site was in downtown. If you recognize this, in the downtown area from the 110 to 10 freeway. It's like a little island. I took a 17-mile path throughout downtown, and the bottom one is kind of a zoning. Throughout this 17-mile, I started to photograph the facades of these buildings. I started taking pictures, and since these pictures were geotagged, meaning that I had the longitude, latitude, and altitude, I was able to pinpoint these pictures throughout Google Maps and figure out where each of these buildings are. I understood that there are a lot of material overlaps, building types, and zonings happening throughout downtown. If you ever go in downtown Los Angeles, you see that there is no existing grid in downtown. Downtown is in an overlap of grids over grids throughout years that happen to overlap with one another and create the grid that we see now. If you ever go to Fashion District, if you go to Flower District, those areas, you as you're going down the street, you turn to the right or the left, and all of a sudden you end up in a street that looks like a sidewalk, but it's actually a street. It's narrow, and then you have areas that the streets are wider, they're smaller. There's like this complicated situation downtown. A lot of us don't really want to really drive in downtown. So from that, I started to break down. Unfortunately, the picture is not really good, but at this little chart here, I broke down the pictures into locations and materials that was the buildings were from, like glass, brick, concrete, stucco. And the next step was to study these buildings and figure out what type of building they are, type 2, type 3, and what kind of zoning they are, and then overlapping it on top of a zoning regulations now, and realizing that there is a lot of buildings that are in that zone but don't belong there. From that, I started to create this grid system. So these little grid systems that you see, they are where those pictures are from, each of them, and each of these colors represent a material, meaning glass, concrete. This is a interactive Google 3D program that I was able to, through Grasshopper and Rhino, and import it into a live Google. And these areas means that the picture was either taken from this building or that building, and then I overlapped the existing, the new zoning regulations that is on there now, and realizing in some areas the height of the building is either more than what it's supposed to be, either because the buildings are really old, or in these and then overall, if you look at it, it's scattered all over the place. There is no unity in the zoning or the grid system. You have tall buildings next to small buildings. You have warehouses next to commercial buildings. You have residential that used to be a commercial, and it's just an overlap of zoning array. It's a headache. And I started to create my own, saying that if you take each of the colors as a warehouse, residential, or commercial, and I started to create my own grid. I started to put in my own information into it, figuring out like what happens if I put this commercial space next to residential. What if I take a whole bunch of, like a chunk of the building and then put it next to a commercial? What happens? And then from like these areas, this whole thing was a warehouse next to a commercial, next to a residential. What happens if I integrate them? And then there's like a more aggressive integration between the two. These little charts at the bottom, through Grasshopper, I was able to also figure out the square footages of each of these areas. I can change them manually, and those square footages will also change. So it gave me a control of knowing what each area, what's the square footage of each area and zones and types are. I started the little experiments with the information that I got. I chose two of those patterns that from these guys. I chose two of them and started to play around with them. I said, what if I create my own city and block, play around with the city and block system? What happens if I create my own streets width? What happens if I say I wanted to have a 10 meter, exactly 10 meter streets? And what happens to the blocks? In some areas you see that the block completely disappears because it's so small, it can't handle an offset of 10 meter within itself. And then this is like a 10 meter, I have the chart for it, the square footages for it. The next step was to, what happens if I pinpoint a focus point and radiate that 10 meter from that point? So as you see, the streets that are closer to the focus point are wider, and as it gets farther out, you don't see the streets anymore. So those are the areas that you can't use the car, you have to walk. And then the next one over is when I have two focus points. And those two focus points, as you see, when it's closer to the center, the streets are wider. As it gets out, further out, the streets become smaller. And then the square footages also change if I change the street width. So this was like a little play that I did with the information that I got to see how I can experiment with this city and grid and block system. At the end, I created this very horrifying image of one of the grids. I started to say that if all of the zoning in a commercial space where I was going to use all the extended height that I was allowed to, and then the warehouses, and I kind of just created this very surreal image to see how messed up this grid is. The idea was to, after I have all these data and information, I said, what if I go back to the beginning? I study grid. What is the grid? For us, mainly the regular grid is the grid that the streets run into a 90-degree right angle, and it continues without interruption. The second one is the Manhattan grid, which most of us know, since the Manhattan has these grid system and continues without an interruption. It has, and also it's easy to add or take certain areas out, like the Central Park. It's like a bigger couple of these guys together. The third one is Eixample. I think I'm saying it right. It's from Barcelona. It's a little area in Barcelona, the Catalonia area, which the buildings have these little chamfered corners. These are, in this block, there's quite a few buildings. There's like a little courtyard in the middle. But the grid system is that they have these chamfered corners, which created this amazing opportunity for open space, for community space. And it, obviously, as you see, it's a more open space than the Manhattan grid. Throughout time, and then the second one was obviously against the grid. I chose the Paris grid because there's so many interruption in this grid that looks like each area is continuing its own. This is like a radio central one, there's like a block system, and then you have all these central areas. So it's completely against what I think of a grid system. So there have been a lot of attempts at urban planning and visionary urbanism. Most architects try to go from this desirable social outcome to a form, meaning that they're trying to, they have all these programs that they want to fit into this form. And they're saying, like, I want to have this, I want to have this, I want to have this, and then I want to put it into this form. I'm flipping this process. What am I doing? I'm actually flipping this process towards, instead of me being, I want to do this into this shape, I create the shape and I put the programs in it. Meaning that certain shapes I create for commercial, certain shapes I create for warehouse. This is one of the reasons that I'm saying flip is because I'm working backwards. Starting with a technique to create from by using pattern recognition, and repetition in a 2D aspect, flipping it into a 3D aspect. In case going from a pattern being a figure ground into a volume and a shape. These are some of the examples that I worked with. The first one is a Noli map. Second one, Mission Grand Axis from OMA. The Radio City, Le Corbusier, Parc La Valette. These are some of the, I'm going to explain it in the next 10. I'm just going to give you an overview of what they look like. Noli map is, because it's important for me, it's one of the first maps ever made of a city. The significance of it is the fact that the way it was being represented, meaning that the buildings were pochade and then the open spaces were white. So it's the first figure ground map that was ever made. It's very simple. I redrew it so you can see it better. The second project is Mission Grand Axis by OMA. From the area La Défense. This project was actually a competition by OMA in Paris. They were chosen to have to create this urban plan for La Défense because this little area, Paris's grid, as most of the European countries are, has this very old kind of European grid that they are very proud of, and they assume that every building in Paris is a historical building, even the not so worthy buildings, but they all think that they should be preserved. But not all of the buildings are worthy. So they created this area that is more, right now it's like a business district for them, started to develop it, and then the question was like how, if that first stage of that little area gets finished, and I think it's this area right now, how are they going to expand it into, and grow it into the new grid? So what OMA did is that they started to scrape off the grid and scrape off all the buildings that are there, and keeping only certain buildings because of their either historical or they were part of the like a governmental building. And what they did, they play around. They started to apply, in the first one that I showed you, they applied the Manhattan grid on it in a different angle, and how it's going to grow. The other one, of course, the Le Corbusier's project. I personally love this image because of the fact that at this edge, you see that there's two different layouts, and you kind of see this amazing differentiation between what we call a city, like the Paris grid at this existing, and the new one that he's coming up with. In his idea and in his world, the perfect utopia for him was the fact that to create these towers, and as it moves outside towards the towers, he created these block system, which you can see it here and also here, the residential blocks. And then people would move in, and he had this very specific way for them to live. He had this plan for them to eat a certain way or do their laundry in a certain way. And he had this whole thing laid out. The problem with this one, I personally have, is the fact that when you look at it, yes, it has differentiation with like these two, but how are you going to expand it? This is a question that I've been asking in all the precedent studies that I've been doing for this one. How are you going to be able to expand this grid in a way that it doesn't eventually end up to be this mess on this side? How do you create this pattern that is able to expand, able to grow without having to having an interruption in the middle of it that is completely different from what it is? And these bottom ones are kind of a perspective views that he has. The thing that I love is how detailed he figured out the circulations, the buses, the streets, the different levels of interaction, and the fact that at this part, most of the streets are empty. The fourth project that I looked at was Parc Lavalette by OMA. For me, the reason that I really, really liked this one, and it was very intriguing, it was back in the time that I thought that this study can be a building and not an urban plan. But if you add a ground plane on this side, it looks like a high-rise. It looks like a section or an elevation of a building. It doesn't look like a plan. It can act as both. The significance of this is a series of parallel bands that run through, separates the specific programs and categories, and they also avoid any interruption and any cluster within the programs. And of course, the third one is how it looks like an elevation with specific buildings or sections and specific programs within it. After that, I said instead of studying the precedents, let's look for a specific pattern that can grow. Because I was asking this question, how this grid can grow over and over again. I started to look at the patterns that can be continued forever. These patterns you can add on and on and on, and they would look the same. There was no interruption in them. I personally love this one because it has this 2D, 3D, and it's very effortless to make it. And these are some of the other examples. In these cases, like this one looks like a zipper pattern. And these cases, there's like interlocking going on within the pattern. I chose the houndtooth pattern, which is this one. Most of you are familiar with because it's a pattern on everyone's clothes. But I said I don't want to use a pattern. I just don't want to plug this one in and have the same thing as Le Corbusier's project, that it will grow to be the same thing over and over again. And I said, why don't I play around with the pattern? I started to create other iterations from this pattern. Meaning on this one, these rows were flipped and mirrored. This one is the same pattern. I just started to divide it in a different way and create another set of patterns from it. This one is again, same patterns, different breakouts. This one is specifically my favorite because it has this weaving characteristic into it. And then when you start to break out the patterns in different ways, they started to create their own directions. Because in these ones, I allowed the pattern to stay within this. But when I started to create, break it out in different parts, it started to create its own direction. So this is where we get to the actual thesis project. My advisor was Florencia Pita from Pita and Bloom. I absolutely recommend to visit their work and websites. It's very interesting. They mainly work with patterns and unusual shapes. And my special thesis advisor was Tom May. The site for my project, I very much like the Mission Grand Axis. I chose this very specific site in downtown because most of the overlaps, because on this part is where all the big towers are. This is where the financial districts are, all the warehouses, commercial spaces, buildings. Most of the overlaps and the chaos happens in that area. So this is kind of a plan that I made. As you see, that area that I'm choosing is this mess of a cluster. Fun fact, this is sci-arc. And what I did, I scraped out the buildings and applied my own pattern into it. I kept the blocks. I didn't get rid of the blocks, just to see how it will interact with the new pattern that I put in. And then you see these certain areas. You have this perfect image, and then you have these little nuts and pieces from the other prunes that has, it's like 2 inches by 2 inches or something. I scaled up the pattern to see this. So these are like different iterations in the duration of how these patterns interact with this grid. Is the problem the grid system, or is the problem the pattern of the buildings, or like the shape of the figure ground of the buildings? I applied different patterns into it. Again, you see that the street and the current grid started to interrupt the pattern so much that it was, in some areas, it was useless. Bigger scale. Just a reminder, just like the Noli map, the figure ground, buildings are the black, open spaces and public spaces are the white. This is the other pattern, but what I did is I started to combine the same pattern in three different directions. Actually, 4 different directions. And I started to combine, very much like those color studies that I did with the square footages. I tried to do the same thing with these guys. And I started to combine 4 different patterns just to see how the pattern itself will interact with one another. But my main focus was the grid and the streets. These are just little studies. Same pattern, different scale, and how dramatic the difference is between the two. At the end, I ended up with this figure ground. This is the figure ground that I chose to work with 4 different patterns into one another. One thing that I did that I didn't do on the last one, I overlapped these patterns into one another. They are generated from the same source, so that it's very easy for one another to merge. And you won't see the interruption, because whenever they merge, they line up with the pattern underneath it. But as you notice on this one, I didn't include the streets. The existing grid that was the city grid, I took it out. I said, it has no benefit for me. It started to shatter this pattern into so many ways that it was unusable, so I'm just gonna get rid of it. But the problem is that now I have to think about a way to create streets. And I said, well, this pattern allowed me to generate so many different things. It's generated from the same source, and I'm sure I can start to generate a street from there. So those orange ones are the new streets that I started to plan out through the city. They're interconnected throughout in different branches, of course, from the use of those areas, of what they're going to programs of those areas. The streets can extend and merge. You can add the street there. It can also connect with one another in directions that you want. This is an overlap of the new street to the old one, and you see that how orderly and organized it is compared to the old streets. These are the old ones. And they perfectly merge with the existing in these centers, corners, depends on the condition that they're merging from. One of the questions that I got from the instructors, they were saying, what are these little notches that you have? I said it can be a little ramp or a parking slot for the buildings. So this is just showing the streets. Dramatic change between the two. And this is an overlap of the new one with the old one. Tom May at the meeting asked me where the site specifically is, and I told him, well, this is the temple and this is this area. And I said, well, where would my building be? And I said, oh, I'll show you, because he has a Caltrans building. Oh, this is persistent. There we go. The Caltrans building, I was like, oh yeah, I'll show you. And I pointed to this area that was demolished. And I said, oh, this would have been there. He didn't seem very happy. He didn't like my project at the end. But yeah, just to show you where. These little areas that you see in white, I'll show you in up close. Those are where the overlaps happened. So just to show you how these areas started to merge within existing, I'll show you a 3D of this so you can see it better. In certain areas you have an underground happening, and then in certain areas you have an overlap. But you see that this is a different pattern, this is a different pattern. But they merge perfectly. There is no interruption within the two. This is where all the 4 patterns, and the different grays represent different functions. Warehouses, commercial buildings, residential. I have like 2 different residential commercial buildings. Those were supposed to be like a mixed use building space because they're in they weave to one another. This is another close up. Again, 2 different patterns overlapping to one another. These whites where the areas are overlapping. I did shadow studies for these areas in different times of the day. This is a 1 p.m. Shadow study. As you can see, like some areas are darker. It's because I changed the height of these buildings they're not all the same height. It's a close-up of the 1 p.m. study. The 11 a.m. study, different pattern. This is my overall installation that I had. Ended up, just to give you a scale, this is 60. This is 60-inch model. This is pretty big. This was a figure ground study. It's an acrylic model, laser cut individual pieces, and then interlocked to one another. This is the 3D. They were all laser cut into contours. As you see, they're elevated, but they still overlap with the other pattern. Have a close-up of this one.
What's the difference between black and white?
They're different programs. Commercials, warehouse, and then you have residentials and then mixed use. So this is another one. In certain areas, you see this little tail is lifted. In some areas, the tail is down, and then it's a high-rise tower. And then you have areas that they overlap, but they don't touch. There's a space between them, so it can be used. You see that what I'm talking about? It's right here. They're still overlapping, but it's functional as a usable space. This is the other side. They when they interact with the streets. And then you have, like a little thing that coming out. You can use the street underneath. So after kind of going through and studying, there are a lot of conversation came out from this thesis because property lines, you have issues of property line, private spaces, you have air rights. There are like so many conversations come out of this. But again, one of the main things about this one is the fact that you are able to expand, combine the two without interruption, but it doesn't have to be the same thing over and over again because you're creating different, generating different patterns from that one. This was one of the attempts at creating this. My argument was the fact that these patterns were a way to mark buildings, specific functions, to show the commercial and private spaces, but my jury didn't, and I'm just showing this because you can see, jury didn't like the pattern. They said it's too much. You're trying too much. So the conversation kind of ends with this idea of creating these spaces and creating this grid system within this chaotic grid system that exists there. It can be a good thing and a bad thing. You're starting to create a city that can expand only a certain way. You're creating streets in a certain direction, angles and directions versus what you see existing. Again, air rights, property lines, because there's a lot of overlaps happening. There's a lot of interruption happening. So these are one of the main conversations that came out of the project. Of course, this project is still an ongoing experiment and an ongoing investigation of this grid system and pattern that we're talking about. But hopefully in the future I'll be able to work more on it and expand it into different ways. Any thought that you might have, but thank you so much for your time, and thank you. Any comments? I understand it's too much. Too much information, crazy information also.
Well, since no one is asking anything,
Sure.
it's a great project, great exercise, but what was the purpose of it besides your thesis?
The
The starting point.
The starting point was this idea of, because as I said in my fourth year, there was this disorganization of a grid system. We are in an age that we are capable of designing things beyond our imagination. How can our cities still in this chaotic stage? And the idea is to create, the idea was to, why don't we tackle this? Most of the projects and most of the preference studies that I do, they date back into the 1980s. The new ones don't really challenge the cities anymore, those utopia that we're looking for, like Le Corbusier's projects or OMA. So I wanted to tackle something that hasn't been done for a long time and create something that was beyond our imagination. This is obviously a theoretical and very contemporary, beyond contemporary project, but it creates a discourse within architects. It creates a topic that, okay, something like this can be done one day, maybe something similar to it. So,
Yes.
yes.
Do you believe with the grid system, you get more uniformity or more variety?
Well, one of my things is I'm disappointed in the grid system. This is a pattern system. The grid system, because the cities are from the grids, you have,
I mean,
the
system
pattern.
that you're
So you're
presenting.
saying, what's it?
The system that you're presenting, that you're offering, is it giving you more uniformity or
Yeah.
more variety?
For me, it's a satisfaction of both. Because it gives you the uniformity in the sense that these patterns can overlap without an interruption, they can combine to one another, and at the same time, it creates a very desirable look. So it's an idea for both, that it's not something that I'm not only representing this pattern specifically, like the Corbusier project, and saying these towers are going to go forever and these plaques are going to go forever, there's no change. At the same time, I'm creating these different ones that can merge, so for me, it's both.
It seems to me that at the end, you propose 4 different grids mixing with each other. So it tells me that probably you wanted to solve the problem of too uniformity.
The multi-patterns is just because of the fact that you don't want a repetitive look. You don't want to have an option say that, okay, that pattern is going to go forever. You can't interrupt it, you can't change it. I'm trying to talk about the fact that, okay, I'm presenting a pattern, but this pattern is able to adjust with your needs, adjust with your different ideas and looks that you want to go for, but within the boundary of that grid, that pattern. So, I don't know if I answered it.
Yeah.
So I have a question.
Yes.
I'm a fan of that pattern.
Yeah. Thank you.
That was a really great experiment that you did, and I know you're all about like pushing it further and further and get more out of it, and that's like awesome. It's great that you came up with it. The grid itself on a 2D level, it represents itself in a 3-dimensional way that even if you want to generate like towers out of it, it's totally like feasible on the grid system that you actually created. I would challenge that when you are creating all these grids with these edges and diagonal lines and cuts, that through your physical models, you can see how it has been shaped with that grid.
Right.
What would you do with architects who want to appreciate and respect your city grid system?
So you're talking about these?
Yeah, all the like random towers and zonings that you basically pretty much presented. What would you do with an architect that with due respect of your grid system on site, they are trying to do a new figure ground, something like more with more curvature, or something that's not going with these angles. It would challenge the site and the grid itself. Have you thought that if like these project gets like more than 1 and 2 and 3, again another grid would sit on top of mess it up?
Yeah. So that's a great question, because that is the topic when you change the pattern and add another information to it. If you recall, the patterns that I made in the beginning that I started to challenge the very first pattern, the black and white pattern. So if I start to add curvature into these sides, it will mirror itself and repeat throughout. It's a union pattern look. That if an architect wants to mirror a pattern, well, it has to be within the boundary and existing of this pattern. So if the black gets a curve on this side, at some point it will go throughout the entire site. And still it's capable of merging with the other patterns because it's generated from the same base.
But then how would the neighbor side would respond to that if they want to follow the diagonal or angular
merge.
system?
It will merge. They will just continue with their look. But this one will have, like, you know, when we are combining three different patterns into others, it's the same merging system. But they will able to merge. But it's a good question. That will be another iteration work.
Another thesis.
Yeah.
In your thesis, did you study the,
Oh no, go for it. I was looking at you.
did you take the utilities in consideration?
Did I take what? I'm sorry.
Utilities and city services, and if so, did you find any advantage or disadvantage
Yeah, so
created by this pattern?
What's the question?
I find like utilities and city systems, what's the advantage of having this? Well, the good thing is that they will fall into a same orientation, same place. Of course, as we're talking about, I'm talking about city ground. Let me show you. Because when I say I'm designating this pattern to a building, these little areas, in like a further thought that I have, these little areas become part of either a building or a city operational spaces. So because you have to accommodate for the city systems and all the grids. So for me was that this pattern allows you to fit, it's a discussion from the beginning that I had. We're not going from a social outcome to a shape, we're going from a shape to a social outcome. So you have the shape, you can fit whatever you want and whatever you desire, depending on the spaces that you have and things that you need to fit into the grid. So
I have two questions. I know the whole project is kind of theoretical. So with respect to that aspect of your project,
I mean, if you want to take it reality.
yeah. So I got two questions about that. First of all, we tried grid system for years and years, for decades,
Right.
centuries, and we know that every grid that architects or people use in any cities comes from locality, comes from function from lifestyle. It doesn't matter if it's in Hamadan or Fuman or Paris or Manhattan. And with this pattern system, what this pattern system come from? Do you have a base point for that? Do you have a lifestyle, or do you have a view of some quality in the city that make you to choose one pattern over another one? And the second question is that even grid system most of the time dominate architects' creativity. And pattern system, we know that pattern system is way more strong than grid systems. I saw some of the volumes and proposed building in your project, and they all look fabulous. But if different architects with different styles and different tastes want to design building in this pattern system, how you see relation between their creativity and your pattern that you assign to a not a block like 15 block of a city.
So your first question is the same answer that I was giving him. I'm not trying to go from I want this, so what it will look like. I'm going, this is how it looks like, and deal with it. This is how your life is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of one of those very strict points that I was having, because when you do precedent studies like the Corbusier projects, when you study the blocks, there's like a whole description that he had. He was very controlling, the way people live, the way they do things, and it's not possible. There's an individuality that you were trying to achieve. I'm trying to do like, this is the form, and your life within that form depends on you, but it's going to be within that form or within that shape. For this case, it will be the buildings. The second one, it's a good question, but it wasn't part of the thesis, because at this time we were tackling the grid system within a city. The scale was a city. It wasn't individual architects. Eventually the next step would be to how can you be creative within those boundaries. There's a book, I can't remember the name, but he studied the Manhattan. Manhattan has a very specific with strict zonings and setbacks within itself. He started to build these projects within those setbacks, and the shapes that he got from those setbacks, they were crazy. They looked absolute, but he did the max, like the height max, setbacks, everything, and then those buildings started to look really funky. They looked really surreal. This is kind of the same thing, that within those boundaries you have a volume and you have a mass that looks surreal, but eventually, kind of a question that Sarah asked, that if an individual comes in and says like, this is what I want to do, then it becomes a question, how can you be creative within the boundaries of that grid? So there's always that boundary, because that's what you're trying to avoid. You're trying to avoid that chaotic same situation in the city grid. It still figure ground will look different, but you have the overall path. Yes.
Last question, one is not related to your presentation. Just a general question, what transportation and traffic, mostly with this grid system or these loops in the areas that are very congested. Sometimes, for example, in New York City, they used to call it a grid block. So the cars used to go all around the grid or loop, and they block, they move, and then it was expanding until 30 minutes,
Right.
getting all over the city, mostly before the holiday. Or do you have any solutions or study anything regarding this? Or
Well, my solution is that one. Because then, because the conversation is that now you have streets that is about 2 times the regular street, or 3 times bigger than the regular street, within a city. It's not a highway, but it's within the city. So you don't have that traffic jam problems anymore, because you can combine all these different transportation within that streets. It's the size of a highway, but it's like a Le Corbusier project, so with the layers, but this one's creating just a space. Yes.
It's a follow-up question for what maybe asked. As you know, the Corbusier had a kind of social vision.
Right.
His
Okay.
proposal. What is your social vision for presenting this pattern?
Well, mine is the same. Mine is the same thing, that I am presenting the separation within the function, but my control of behavior is not towards the behavior of the people, but it's the behavior of the grid. I'm not saying that you have to do these the certain way or do that the certain way. I'm just saying that the building and the city is going to be built and interact in the same way, but the social life, meaning that the open space, I'm still creating that open space, I'm still creating that public space and then figure ground. But it's the same thought as Le Corbusier, but it's not the same approach. His is more social, mine's more of a grid-based figure ground.
I have one more question
Sure.
regarding, since you've talked about the OMA project
Right.
in this presentation, do you have any idea why the city of Paris chose Chumi's project over OMA?
I think Shumi was for the Parc La Valette.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he was, in my opinion, he was elementing certain areas with the connection and pinpoints. He wasn't overall like excavating out and saying that these bound areas. Schumer was like saying that these are the elements that a pinpoint looks like, you know, there's little call outs, informational call outs. So my opinion was that they didn't want to get rid of that historical grid that they are very fond of. So they didn't want to get rid of those areas. They just wanted an element that says, okay, the city's up to a revolutionized architecture, but it's not. Let's not take it that far. I mean, my take.
This pattern, to me, by its nature, is kind of reply better to an environment is not yet developed, or in
Right.
new development. Now, you specifically superimpose that in existing city block.
Right.
That is where a lot of probably problems arise. You know,
Well, the
city utility, stuff like that, that is already there. What was the reason you proposed this in an existing city block, that all these challenges come to you rather than new development?
Well, I was trying to tease them and be like, mine is better than yours.
Okay.
For the most part, I was trying to tease them and
It
say
doesn't
like,
work.
yeah, I mean, like, because I'm saying that,
Clearly
okay,
it doesn't work.
yeah, mine is so much better, mine has so much space, so many opportunities, and yours don't do much. So don't hold your breath to it. So it was my proposal of, okay, I want to show you what it looks like, because if I scrape everything off, I didn't show you a city grid. The look of my pattern, it wouldn't be so dramatic anymore. You won't see that big differential dramatic look of my pattern and scale anymore. So that's why I was, for the most part, I was trying to tease them and also piss off Tommy.
So you're trying to impress.
Yeah.
Okay.
It backfired. But yes.
It's, this pattern system looks very drastically new idea and different from the existing. But you're using the same terminology for the city: commercial, residential, open space, government office.
Right.
So what do you change
Well,
in the city life, a part of pattern that you are presenting, and why these patterns are only sharp angles? These motifs comes from somewhere, or you are creating all these small motifs?
Small what?
Each element of these patterns.
Right.
Are they? Did you get it from somewhere, or it is your own?
I just played around with the original pattern. These at the end, if you like delete certain lines and colors, you will come back to the houndtooth pattern. The pattern again, it's generated from the same base, same pattern. But your first question, what I'm trying to change in the life of a city, of course, I will be influencing traffic, overlaps of commercial and residential, overlaps of areas that have nothing to do with one another. There is this very, very specific separation between those functions within the city. So you kind of pinpoint a chaotic movement into certain areas. So that's one of the challenges that will, I mean, one of the things that will change into the city. Does that answer the question? Did I understand it right?
For your second question, she chose the sharp angles, but it could be all curved.
Yeah.
All kinds of different patterns, just
For
curved.
now, it was a, for
Right?
now, yeah, for now it was this stuff, otherwise it can go on forever. All right. Seems like we've got all
That was an example.
How much was that?
John?